So just to say, in terms of context, if my slides work, a warning, I do love to talk about research and research jobs. So Laura and Melissa may need to keep me to time. Um, and I also want to, I suppose, give a warning. I'm not going to just talk about psychology jobs. I think psychology graduates have a wonderful range of skills and are very, very able and well positioned to apply for research jobs in other areas of social health and other sciences. So you'll see that I'll talk a lot about projects that may be cross an interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary spectrum. Um, it's really important for me that I'm pitching things in a way that's most helpful. So in a moment, I'm going to use menti.com to just get a sense from you as to what you're hoping to get out of the session. And as Laura's already said, I want you to feel free to post questions and comments in the chat. And then the moderators will bring those to my attention where they're most relevant. I really want this to be an interactive session, but again, there will be plenty of time for Q&A without the recording at the end of the session. So if that sounds okay, I'm going to just change my screen over to menti.com. And if you're not familiar with menti.com, if you're on a phone, a tablet, or your computer, you can go to the website menti.com and use the code you see on the screen, 24274108, to join. And I have three short questions that I want to ask at the beginning, just to get a sense of who's in the room. So hopefully there's no difficulties accessing Menti. So first of all, just where are you joining us from? And what country are you in if you're outside Ireland? And if you're in Ireland, what town are you in? So just take a moment to share where you're joining us from. I am at home this evening in Tallaght, where I'm from and still live. I must warn you that George the cat may come and say hello at some point. So apologies if he does. So good to know that we've got people from both inside and outside Dublin, and I'm conscious that we may have some people who join us later on in the session, maybe coming from work. Okay, so the next thing that I want to ask is, what stage of your career are you at? Would you consider, are you a recently completed undergraduate student? Are you a current postgraduate or a recently completed postgraduate? Because depending on what stage you're at in your career, you may be thinking about different levels of jobs. You may also be thinking about a research assistant post as a pathway to further professional training, or you may be thinking about a research assistant job as an employment opportunity with a view to working in research beyond. So I can see we've got some recently completed postgraduate and undergraduate and a couple of current students as well. So that's great. And then lastly, what I'd love to be guided by at the beginning, and this will just bring up small comments. What would you most like to get? What would you most like to get, or what particular type of information would you like to get in this session? So more than just interview preparation as a general heading, is there anything that you'd most like to get a steer on? And just while you're making your comments there, to say that I've broken down my presentation into 5 phases of preparation and performance in research assistant job interviews. So I'm going to start by thinking about how we find the right jobs to apply for. I'm going to say a little bit about how you might prepare your application for that process. But then obviously we're going to spend some time talking about the interview itself, performing well, managing that interview, and really showing the best. So you can see that there's some questions that are already coming up. Are there part-time roles? How I love that comment, how to feel prepared in an interview. Just to say, I'm in psychology many, many years, but still, when I start into a talk like this or an interview for a grant that I've put a huge amount of work in for, I'm always crushingly nervous in the last 5 minutes. Before that, I'm fine, and I think I'm going to be okay. So those nerves are key. A lot of questions about what are the parts of the process like. So hopefully I can illustrate that as we go through. Okay, so that's very helpful. I'm going to go back to my slides and we're going to start with that first, a first piece of context. I I do the research talk at the annual PSI NIBPS Careers event every year. I love giving that talk, and it's because I feel really passionately that research is a really positive career for psychology graduates to go into. It has its ups and its downs, but it can be very rewarding and it can lead into many other things. And roles in research and indeed careers are very accessible for psychology graduates. And the reason is the skill set that you develop as a psychology undergrad, even without that additional training of postgrad, is really broad. Typically, you've got training in both qualitative and quantitative research methodology, but you've also been trained in research design, project management, project implementation, team working, dissemination, so many areas that you have a very broad skill set, even at undergraduate level. And in my experience, when you finished your undergraduate, even before you do any further training, your biggest challenge are your nerves and your confidence. Your skills are not the issue. So I'm going to say a little bit about how to maximize that. Well, for many people, the opportunity and option to undertake postgraduate training, either as a transition into further professional training or as professional development, is also very common. And increasingly, I do see a distinction between research assistants jobs that look for a minimum of an undergraduate degree, either in psychology, or often you'll see reference to cognate disciplines, health or related areas. But increasingly, you will see a master's level qualification as either a desirable component, something that will make you attractive and competitive, or for some roles that have more responsibility, a mandatory requirement. So even with your undergraduate degree in your pocket, you can apply for roles where the minimum qualification is a BSc or a BA in psychology or similar disciplines. But you may find that, particularly for roles with a bit more responsibility, they're going to want a postgraduate qualification. And I've got a really good example to illustrate that. But what I want you to keep in mind is that you have a broad range of skills and competencies that are a solid foundation for many, many roles. And one of the things that I'm going to come back to is the distinction between having the experience of particular things, particular tasks, but also having the skills or the capacity for that task. And I will come back to that. So I'm delighted that there are people who are interested in research assistant posts. They can be a really nice stepping stone onto other things, but they can also be the stepping stone to a career in research. Okay, so as I said, I've broken my presentation down into 5 phases. And I want to start with taking time to think about how important selecting the right job to apply for is. And I think the challenge with research assistant jobs is that they can be advertised on a wide range of recruitment and other websites. When I do my talk at the careers event and for today's talk, I just did a really quick search in Google. Other search engines are available to see what jobs there were currently. And looking at websites like Glassdoor, Irish Jobs, and LinkedIn, there are a range of things out there. But at the same time, you'll also see jobs being advertised on social media, things like Instagram, X, and other platforms. And I think particularly LinkedIn has become a really active platform. Obviously, it does job advertising, but having a profile of LinkedIn once you graduate and using that to follow particular organizations or individuals can be really helpful and influential. But you do have to look quite widely for these jobs. And coming to the last point there, looking for psychology research assistant will unnecessarily narrow your options. Every week, I'm seeing jobs being advertised in aspects of health research, other areas of social science, sport and exercise. And you definitely need to be open to the possibility of those posts being relevant to you. You have to look beyond the discipline to look at the skill set that the job is asking for, and to spend time looking at the job description, if there is one, the mandatory and desirable experience that's specified, and particularly really good job descriptions will have a good breakdown of the roles and responsibilities that the tasks have. And even if psychology is not in the title of the job, and even if psychology is not in the degree that they want you to have, look at those skills, look at those roles, and ask yourself, have I experience of doing these things? And you can be really surprised by how much experience you have. And again, I have an example that I'm going to show in a few minutes. But the best preparation is learning to look broadly but effectively at jobs that are advertised in research roles, and asking yourself, is this at the right level for my skill set? Asking yourself, is this demanding the right skill set and competencies that I have or that I feel able to develop? And that can be really important. So phase one is learning to look widely for these jobs. And again, please do feel free to post into the chat if you have a specific question you want me to clarify, or if there's a general question that is relevant to a particular phase. But we will come back to these things in the Q&A. So I want to use this example to illustrate some of those points, and I will come back to it. So this was a job that I found on LinkedIn just today. It's open at the moment. It's a research assistant working on a project in the National College of Ireland here in Dublin. As you can see, it's a part-time job, but it is a 13-month contract, which is, got a good time frame. This might suit a postgraduate student or a PhD student who's studying and it needs some additional work experience, but also work opportunities. And as you can see, the salary is the research assistant scale for the IUA, the Irish Universities Association. And this is a publicly available researcher salary scale that you can see. Point one tends to be very basic, straight out of undergraduate level roles. And this is 0.7, which is about halfway up on the scale. And as you can see, it's about 36,000 per annum as a salary. So what does this job look like? So this is the first part of the job description. So you'd be working with Dr. Michelle Kelly, who's an associate professor at NCI, and her colleague, Caoimhe Hannigan. And as you can see, there's a link in with Tallaght University Hospital, and some of you may know Dr. Gareth McDermott, who's very involved in PSI and in the Division of Neuropsychology. So the first thing it gives us is a set of key responsibilities, the tasks that this job is going to entail. And it's really important that, again, in thinking about applying for a job, that you look carefully at what they're looking for. And think for yourself, what jumps out at you here? Immediately, you can see that there is qualitative and quantitative data collection and analysis. Immediately, you can see things that are maybe less familiar, PPI, which is public and patient involvement. So this is looking for someone who can support activities that involve communicating research to representative stakeholders and engaging with them to seek their feedback. We can see there's general administrative duties. When I looked at this, the one that surprised me was coordination of placement activities for trainee psychologists, not one that you would often see. But I could imagine that for some people, they would look at this list and immediately be intimidated by some of the tasks more than others. And that's understandable, but you need to push past that initial intimidation to think, okay, these are the responsibilities. What of these do I feel comfortable with? What of these do I think I could develop? The other part of the job description then outlines the qualifications. And again, you've got this presentation of essential qualifications, things that the person must have, and desirable. So if you look at the qualifications, again, they want a primary degree in psychology or other related health or social care discipline. This job does have a postgraduate qualification as essential. And realistically, if it is specified as essential, it is important that you have that qualification. But let's say you're coming into the end of your MSc, or you're just finishing up a 1-year master's, you don't have the qualification in hand. I would encourage you to contact the contact person on the job, typically it's the PI, to ask whether they would consider someone who's about to graduate. Maybe you have an indicative GPA, maybe you've got your results, but you just haven't graduated. So don't be afraid to check in with the PI to find out about that postgraduate qualification. It is also possible that that postgraduate qualification will be listed as desirable. And that means that obviously you might be more competitive with a postgraduate qualification, but it doesn't mean that you shouldn't apply if you don't have one. From a practical point of view, it can be helpful, because if there's a points system for qualifications, you will receive points for having a master's, even when it's not an essential or mandatory component. The other thing I want to highlight here is the reference to knowledge and experience. And that goes back to the distinction I mentioned, that you will have done some of these tasks. You will have collected data for your final year project, whether it be qualitative or quantitative. But even if you've only done one, you have knowledge of the other. So if your final year thesis was a quantitative experiment, you'll have received training in interviewing and interview techniques. So be comfortable with the distinction, as I said already, between things you know and understand and things you have direct experience of. But paying attention to a job description at this level allows you to think about the feasibility of applying, the likelihood that you'll get past that first phase of shortlisting into interview, and also it will guide your application. And again, while we're talking about preparation for interview, I do think that one of the strongest foundations for an effective job interview is your application. I have recruited at every level, right up to and including deans and full professors. And you would be surprised how often the application is not strong on paper. And not because the person is lacking in experience, but because there's a sense that the person hasn't actually looked at the job carefully and hasn't understood what's involved. And most importantly, hasn't shown that they have the skills that are required or the capacity to develop them. So when you're preparing your application form, it is the first foot in the door of the interview. You want to show that you have attention to detail. You want to show that you have an understanding of the role, and you want to show that you have the capacity to take on that post. If you get to interview, you have met the minimum criteria to be eligible for the post. If you're not eligible, they won't interview you. But if you've gotten to interview, you know you've met it. And how do they know that you've met those criteria? Because your application shows it. So a couple of tips and a little bit of a bugbear for me. Is there an application form or not? Again, some posts will have a required mandatory application form that you must fill in. And if you don't include that, you have not met the mandatory requirements, so you can be excluded at that stage. Most jobs will ask for a CV. I think it's really important to have a balanced CV. And what I mean by that is one that is detailed but accessible. You know, when I've recruited for senior academic jobs, you might be expecting a very long CV. But a CV should always be accessible. And look, we're not doing a session on CV preparation, but it is your calling card, and finding a way to make it detailed and accessible is key. Laura, was there a question?
Yeah, there's a question in there. How does professional research experience compare to post-grad qualifications from the perspective of recruiters? I only have an undergrad, but I did a research internship for 1.5 plus years.
This is an excellent question. And actually, recently I had this conversation with one of my own research assistants who has a higher diploma in psychology. So it is a profession, it's a postgraduate qualification, but it is a first qualification in psychology. I think if there is a mandatory requirement for a postgraduate qualification, it's very hard to make experience count in the same way. If it's a desirable criterion, absolutely your research can be comparable. Your research experience can be comparable. So an internship, which is, having the opportunity to engage with research work outside of your own research projects, are really important. In the instance of my student, I did advise them he was looking at a job that was had a mandatory requirement of a postgraduate. And I did encourage him to contact the PI and to ask about it. And the PI did come back to say that the nature of the role did require someone to have a postgraduate training experience. So that was very clear. So I would say, to explicitly answer the question, they are very comparable in terms of experience, but if there is a mandatory requirement for a postgraduate qualification in psychology, you will need to be able to show that you have that first qualification, which might be a BA, BSc, or a conversion course, and then that you have a secondary qualification at master's or level 9 level. So I hope that answers your question. But if in doubt, contact the PI, contact the named person and ask, and do it in plenty of time before the deadline so that you can get a direct answer. Okay? Thanks, Laura. The last thing I want to mention is the cover letter, because I feel very strongly about this. The cover letter is often the first thing that the person is going to read about you. And I have seen everything from a 2-line cover letter saying, I would like to apply for this job, to a very clear and detailed letter which stated very explicitly how the person met each of the mandatory and desirable criteria. Now, those criteria should be clear in your CV, but if it's not, if, for example, you had a post and you want to illustrate how that post helped you to develop certain skills, the cover letter can reinforce your suitability for the role, but it can also show your interest in the area, because that can often be a hurdle as well. Maybe you haven't worked in that area. Maybe it's a very specific health role and your work has been more in social psychology. The cover letter can be, again, that foot in the door to show your interest in the role. Couple of big warning signs, though. Sometimes errors in the application can be the very fine line between getting shortlisted and not. So it's really important that you check the presentation, even things like, make sure you're addressing the person by their correct name. I've had my name misspelled on applications for posts, which is a tiny thing, but when you've got 5 interview places and you've 20 applications, you are looking at what will separate really strong candidates. So, double check names, because typos make for a poor impression and you want to get your foot in the door. So a key component to an effective interview is a strong application that makes your mark, that puts yourself forward. I hope that's okay. And again, do feel free to post any questions. So moving on to actual preparation for the interview. So you've applied for the job, you've gotten the great news that you've been shortlisted. Now is the time to do more research. And look, you've been trained in research, so this is not unusual for you. Laura, there was a question there.
Yeah, so there was another question that's just come in, more relevant just before you move on from this to this new phase. So can non-technical skills, for example, project management, team working, dissemination experience from other industries count? So like asking as a mature student, kind of switching career.
Absolutely. And I think some of those more general skills, those transferable skills that I mean, undergraduate students will gain from other jobs and other roles, and also those students who are coming into psychology from other careers will have in bucket loads. It's really important that you show those examples. So I think in the previous job description, you can see general administrative duties as required, support for project management activities as specified in the plan. They're areas where you can show you can bring that experience from other areas and really show how that is relevant. And in a moment, I'm going to talk about sort of mapping this sort of information to your interview preparation so that you have examples, so that if you are asked about, have you ever supervised data collectors before? And maybe it's a post where you're going to be coordinating some more junior research assistants. You may not have supervised a research assistant, but you may have worked in an office where you supervised interns as part of your role, and that would be a good example. So I hope that helps. Laura, another question?
Yeah, so there's another question from somebody who says that they have experienced an application for a research assistant where they were requested details of published research, and this person starting a postgrad, so they don't have any published research and they're unsure how to complete that part of the application.
That's an excellent question. And I think for me, again, it's about showing experience, skills, or capacity. So you may not have the experience of writing a publication. You may, though, be able to say that that as part of your degree, sometimes for master's theses, they're written as peer-reviewed articles. So you can stress the experience you've had of writing that. If you're at an undergraduate level and your thesis was more traditional, again, you can highlight how you would have experience of writing for research, of writing research reports. And obviously, as a psychology student, you're very familiar with the requirements of publication. So you can pitch the capacity to do that even if you haven't done it. So if you have the experience, great. If you have the skills through similar activities in your training, that's key. If in doubt, and if for this person who shared this question, if this is the only bit of the required components that you can't say you can do, share your enthusiasm for developing those skills. That's going to be key. Laura?
Another question, if the postgrad master's is a first qualification and it's a conversion, is that generally considered to be the same as an undergrad? This person's BA is a joint one in English and psychology, so not sure if it counts as they weren't eligible for PSI graduate status.
Yes, so this is a really important thing to be aware of. So in psychology, we're very used to conversion programs. And they are often shorter because they recognize the skill set that the applicants have, that the students have. When you're coming from a previous degree in a range of areas, there are a lot of transferable skills. But when the requirement is for a master's in psychology, it typically is referring to a second qualification. So in those situations, an honors degree in psychology or equivalent, that equivalent is referring to a conversion program that is your first qualification in psychology. So it will be important if they say that they want a master's in psychology as well as an undergraduate degree, they are typically looking for that. But as I said, you're not just going to be eligible to apply for psychology jobs. You're going to be eligible to apply for research jobs that are in other disciplines. And in those situations, if they're looking for general social science undergrad or general humanities, your initial degree will count. And then you can show those additional research skills that your training in psychology has offered you. So that may be more relevant for a non-psychology research role where they are recognizing at that broader range. But if it's a very clearly psychology focused role and it talks about an undergraduate in psychology or equivalent and a master's in psychology, I'd be pretty confident that they are looking for that additional set of skills that the second qualification brings. Okay. It's great that there's so many questions about, how to pitch that application. And I'm looking forward to talking more about those skill set. But the other side of your preparation is learning about the project. So doing your research, finding out as much as you can about the principal investigator and the research team. So in that job from NCI, we saw that Michelle was the PI, and obviously she had a colleague from NCI and another colleague from Tala Hospital working with her. So finding out a little bit about the research agendas of the team, what have they worked on before, and maybe finding out a little bit about what they've published, and in particular finding out about the proposed program of research. So in that sample advert that I showed you, Michelle had mentioned her lab. They talked a little bit about the research project. And this is all really good preparation for you to assess the topic you're going to be working on, to develop your knowledge of the area so that when you go into interview, you can show that knowledge. Now, again, it's not going to be a mandatory requirement that you have specific expertise in the topic of the research, but it's not unusual to see it as a desirable criteria. And again, this is what can make you more competitive. Obviously, you're at interview because you are eligible, but then you have to compete and you want to be the best person on the day. So the ability to do your research about the PI, their team, their program of research, particularly the ability to source recent publications by the team or on the topic of the research, is really, really helpful. You want to be careful in the interview that you don't oversell that knowledge, because you don't want to be caught and tripped up. But you are able to research, you have access to databases, you know how to consume research publications. So actually finding out a little bit about the project can really help you to be competitive in the interview, and having that information to hand. The other two things that I think really are important are reviewing, as I've already said, the roles and responsibilities, identifying again, where do you have exact experience relevant to the role, where you, excuse me, have skill relevant to the role, and where you have the capacity to learn, and knowing the difference between them. So, for example, in the job that I showed, qualitative research was desirable, and experience of NVivo and Atlas and programs like that was a desirable skill. I would never suggest that you pitch yourself to be more able with that sort of technical skill than you actually are, because that could all go horribly wrong if it's a very central component. But no, showing that you know NVivo and you know Atlas and you know those programs is key. Showing your knowledge of SPSS, if that's been your core training, or Python, if you've been trained in those techniques, is the same. But really being very comfortable with, I have direct experience of this task or this responsibility. I have the skill to be able to do this, even though I may not have directly done it, and I have the capacity to learn to do this, is a very helpful distinction. And I would always encourage you, prepare short examples to illustrate those experience, skill, and capacity. Research assistant interviews, they're not going to be very long, and you need to make an effective, efficient impression in order to stand out. And that means being able to give short, snappy examples. And actually moving on then to talk about the actual job interview itself. This is one of my biggest bugbears for psychology students. You are not your project. Your skill set is not limited to your project, whether that's your final year undergraduate project, whether it's your master's thesis, or even your PhD. As a researcher, you want to show that you can pitch your skill set, your capacity. The fact that it was done on a particular topic with a particular project is actually quite limiting, unless the project that you're being interviewed for is in exactly the same area. So my undergraduate project was on bullying in primary school. My PhD was on the same area. But the first project that I was funded to complete as a researcher, as an early stage academic, was in cancer, in children's cancer. Nothing to do with my PhD whatsoever, but I was able to pitch the research skills that that project had developed. So when you look at a job description like this, and it can be intimidating, and you can feel that imposter syndrome of, oh, I can't manage and analyze qualitative data sets. Well, if you did quantitative analysis for your thesis, you have developed and managed a quantitative data set. You have experience of maybe pulling data down from Qualtrics or Qualtrics or Gorilla or Prolific, and tidying it up and bringing it into SPSS. You may have managed data in Excel. Really spend time thinking about, sorry, the cat is crying. Spend time thinking about how you want to show those skills. And that's why when you come into the interview, you really want to be prepared to pitch yourself, not your project. A couple of things that I like to see in interviews, at the beginning of an interview, again, depending on how much time there is, it can be good to be prepared to give a brief opening introduction about yourself. So this might be, a very general opening question where the interviewer says, tell me about what interested you in this project or this area. What drew you to the role? Or where do you see this fitting with your plans for the next few years? Having a sort of a short, little, effective, efficient script that takes 2-3 minutes at the beginning of the interview, if asked, can be really, really helpful. Also, it'll settle your nerves. When I'm interviewing, I'm very conscious of candidates being nervous. I always say very clearly that we want you to perform well because that will give us the best illustration of your skill set. So they will want to put you at ease. And sometimes having that slight little prepared piece, again, effective and efficient, it must be short, can just settle those nerves. And also, good interviewers will see that you're nervous. They'll try to help. If someone is prompting and probing a little bit more, they're doing it not to catch you out. They're doing it to help you to present your skill set as effectively as possible. So having that little intro piece can settle you, can help you give them the basis to ask further questions. Keep in mind that they've read your CV, they've read your letter, they have that information. So they're going to focus on really the mandatory and desirable criteria. And again, depending on the interview process in the job you're applying for, interviews get scored, candidates get scored. You have to meet the mandatory criteria and you will have to meet a minimum cutoff in those mandatory areas. But if you've gotten to interview, you've made that minimum cutoff. Now you want to illustrate those mandatory skills and experiences really effectively. So, for example, if you've described something in detail in your application, and can you give another example? If you've been asked a series of questions, try to bring examples from different places if you can, just to show breadth. But again, the interview has been structured to be able to score you and to score your experience and your skills in those mandatory and desirable criteria. So realistically, there shouldn't be a surprise in those areas if you've done that preparation that I mentioned, that mapping piece. The other thing that I think can happen with nerves is that you're not sure if you understand the question, or you're not sure that you're answering the question. And you may feel that clarifying a question might look bad, or you may feel that checking in to say, have I answered your question effectively might make you look, ineffective, but actually it makes you look responsive. It makes you look engaged. And it can be easy to misunderstand a question when you're nervous. So definitely if a question isn't clear, don't be afraid to ask for clarification. Don't be afraid to check in if they want you to continue. Do not launch into a very long answer. and monopolize the interview. You want to be paying close attention to the interviewers and the panel to see whether they're looking for more information or are they trying to get a word in to actually redirect you. And it can be very difficult in an interview when someone has clearly prepared a long example and they're giving you that long prepared example and there's no way of stopping you. So be conscious of the time you have and the focus of the question. Again, if you've any questions or queries about managing the interview process, now is the time to post them. But again, we will come back to general Q&A. So as I said, you're there to build on your paper application. You're there to provide further illustration of, again, your experience, your skills, and your capacity to learn. And being able to show an interest in the project, a sense of where the role fits in your longer term plans is really important. And that can be another place where students, again, interviewees can feel a little bit unsettled. Do you see yourself going on to do a PhD in this area? Are you interested in further opportunities? Is this a job that you're looking to gain more experience and a 1-year contract suits you really well? Are you desperate to be a clinical / counseling / educational psychologist and you really see that this type of research will help you to develop those skills? Being able to talk to those types of things in interview can be really helpful. The last thing I'll say about managing the interview and managing your performance in the interview is there will be a point at the end, unless you've run over time, that they will ask if you have any relevant questions. And it is important to have some relevant questions to ask. And I would draw a distinction between 3 types of questions. The first type of question, which can be helpful but can blow up in your face, is wanting to really impress them with your knowledge. Again, depending on how they ask this, do you have any questions? Being responsive to how they ask can be key. So if the interviewer says, is there anything that you haven't shared with us yet that you feel is relevant to your suitability for the role? That's giving you the opportunity to either add a little bit more, maybe there's a particular experience you have that you didn't get to talk about, but it also is an opportunity for you to reinforce why you're interested in this role and to leave them with that message. So there is that sort of initial type of question where you have an agenda, something that you want to share, but just be careful that it's on message and that it's relevant. The second type of question that you might ask may be about opportunities and what are the opportunities to pursue a PhD or to extend the work beyond the advertised contract. And those sort of growth opportunities, again, can be very impressive, particularly if it is a project that might grow into something more. So again, do you have particular questions about that? Thirdly, there are also very practical questions that you might want to ask. If it's a half-time post, have they specified that there's flexibility in the days and hours of work? You may have a question about hybrid versus in-person working, and that's a big change in the last 5 years. You may have questions about the location. Again, I'm seeing more and more in job advertisements for researchers that there might be a specification about being expected to be on campus or on site. There might be a specification about traveling to interviews, but there may also be a specification about being eligible to live and work in Ireland. And that may reflect expectations around whether this work can be done in a hybrid context, whether it can be done in a flexible context. Maybe, you're applying for a job that's in the UK. And again, whether they need a researcher who's on site is key. One thing that people may not be aware of is that with data protection, if you're living outside of the jurisdiction of the research, there may be implications for data transfer, GDPR, and things like that that are pertinent. So there can be those very practical things that you might ask at the end. But just be prepared to ask some questions that are meaningful and relevant, and that show your interest in the job and that practical consideration. Laura, you had a question there?
So there's a question here. When talking about research experience, how important is it that the experience is on the same research area of the position, or how much would it matter if they are different areas?
Really good question. So at a minimum, it's not necessary. So in terms of, having interview skills, whether the study is interviewing busy professionals about their views and attitudes, or whether it's interviewing patients, you have those core skills and you want to be able to illustrate them. A step up from that, maybe there's a sensitivity. So maybe you've done interviews with lots of different people, but you've not interviewed children, or you've not interviewed on distressing topics. Again, you can show that you have those general skills. They're the mandatory requirement, but again, to be competitive, experience in the area is going to be impressive. So if the study is on cancer in young people and you have research experience in that area, that is going to be more weighted more than having very relevant methodology experience put in a different area. So it's not a deal breaker, but it just may impact on the competitiveness of other people versus your competitiveness for the role. I hope that answers the question. Is there another question there, Laura?
There's another question where there's a few questions, but there's another question related kind of to that. And that is that this person says they have a very specific area of research that they want to eventually work in as a career. And would it be worth them reaching out to teams and researchers that are doing work in that area to state their interest, even if they're not currently hiring?
Yeah, so this is something that I have a sort of a split view on. So I think it is really impressive to be able to reach out to academics and express your interest in their work and your desire to be, to be aware of any opportunities that there are. Um, the flip side of that though is I really have a bugbear about receiving an email that's clearly being BCC'd to a load of people and says, "Dear ma'am, I would like to do research with you." So if you have an area of interest that you would like to get into, or if there are teams that you're aware of that you'd love to work with, tailor your contact with them. Yes, do reach out to them. Yes, be respectful. Yes, be enthusiastic. But be very clear what you're interested in. Are you looking for opportunities to volunteer? Are you looking for opportunities for paid work? Or are you simply just putting yourself on the radar? But that can be very good, definitely. One of the things that I wanted to take a few minutes to raise, but it may actually work more effectively in the Q&A when we're not recording, is I'm really open to hearing about your anonymously, without identifying individuals, hearing about difficult situations that you faced in interviews. So maybe you completely misunderstood a question and got flustered. Maybe there was a particular technical question that you didn't understand. Maybe there was some confusion about the project, or maybe there was information shared in the interview that made you unsure if the project was for you. But I really do want to be able to talk through scenarios, real or imagined, that you might feel intimidated or unsettled by in the interview setting itself. I mean, just to illustrate, I'm always very conscious of handshaking in interviews, and not because of COVID, but even before COVID. When a room is set up for an interview, you're going to walk in cold. You won't have seen the room before. I've been in situations where the table is too wide to reach out to shake hands. I've been in situations where people haven't wanted to shake hands. I mean, the interview panel. I've been in situations where there's a very tight turnaround for interviews and we just like to get started. I know when I am doing interviews in person, when I'm bringing the candidate into the room, I'll always say, don't worry about shaking hands, just to sort of signal that we're happy for you to sit down and be comfortable. But just getting unsettled at that very beginning can be a little bit flustering. So there can be difficult things that can arise in an interview that you might want to manage. So Laura, is there a question there?
There's a question that is asking, do interviews tend to be in person or do they be online?
It is a mix. Increasingly, I'm finding that interviews for research assistant jobs tend to be online. It's more flexible, it's more efficient and effective. And, particularly if I know in UCD during term time, uh, parking is terrible. So we want to avoid the situation of a poor, unfortunate candidate arriving to the interview later flustered because they couldn't get parking. So, but it could be in person. And again, it may depend on the seniority of the job that you're applying for. They might want to meet you in person. So definitely finding out which is which. If you are doing a Zoom interview, again, a practical tip is, take time to think about how you're appearing on the screen, what's appearing behind you. All right, is your camera one where you're very up close in the screen? I remember interviewing for a very senior role and the person's iron and ironing board was visible in the background. It was a little bit distracting. It wasn't a huge problem, but the more professional and prepared that you can present yourself, the better. And in Zoom, sometimes that can be hard to do depending on where you're sitting and what's in the room. So, for example, George the cat keeps crying beside me, but I'm not able to open the door to let him out. So, things like that can really unsettle you in an interview panel. So, yes, you may have your interview, if not a first interview on Zoom, just be very clear on the arrangements and then think about that professional presentation as well. Okay. So we might come back to the difficult situations when we're not recording, but I want to finish by talking about the final phase of good interview preparation, which is preparation for your next interview. Unfortunately, when you interview, between 6 and 10 candidates for a job, in reality, at least 8 of them are going to be disappointed. Depending on whether the first candidate takes the job, the second candidate may get good news. But it is really important to think about how each interview can be preparation for the next. Ask for feedback no matter what the outcome. Even if you're successful, the maturity and the insight to look for feedback, even when you've been successful, can help you build on your skills. Reflect on what you feel went well and what you feel could have gone better. And in the immediate time after the interview, what will you do differently next time? Again, independent of the outcome. If feedback is offered, do follow up on it. Again, it might be an opportunity to put yourself and keep yourself on the person's radar. But it is a really important potential learning exercise to hear what went well and to hear maybe where you could develop. And in my experience, 9 times out of 10, not getting the job is not that you weren't good enough. It's that there was someone with more skill or experience, or who maybe just presented their skill and experience that little bit better on the day. And that can be disheartening. But again, if you've gotten to interview, you know that you're eligible and suitable for the job. You just want to compete.